Hello, my name is Judith.
My name is Jacob. Welcome to Wannsee, looking at the international dimension of the Holocaust. In this episode, we are talking about Turkey, because Turkey is mentioned in the Wannsee Protocol. It stands on page 6, where the Jewish population of each European country is listed.
But what does Turkey have to do with the Holocaust? It was not occupied by the Germans, but remained neutral throughout the war.
Well, we are going to find out with our guest today. Welcome to the podcast, Corry Guttstadt.
Corry is a Turkologist and historian, previously a machinist, translator, and journalist. Her interest in Turkey arose after the 1980 coup through her commitment against human rights violations. She wrote several books about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism in Turkey. In 2008, she published Turkey, the Jews, and the Holocaust, which is the standard work on the subject. Her next book, Zwischen Aufbruch und Verfolgung, Between Departure and Persecution, deals with the migration history of Turkish Jews to Europe and will be published at the end of this year.
And not to forget, the newest book, Antisemitismus in und aus der Türkei, so anti-Semitism in and from Turkey, that just saw the light last year and is very much to be recommended to all of our listeners. Before we start, we thought it good to give a little context on Turkey before the Second World War. Turkey was only founded in 1923. Before that, it was called the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire was much larger than modern-day Turkey. It encompassed the territory of modern-day Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel, of course, Saudi Arabia, and much of the rest of the Arabian Peninsula.
The Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic state. Large Christian minorities, most of them Armenians and Greeks, lived in the territory of modern Turkey. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire joined Germany in the First World War. During the war, and that is very much important, Turkish forces committed the Armenian genocide. Hundreds of thousands of Armenian civilians were killed, as well as tens of thousands of Greeks.
Together with Germany, the Ottoman Empire lost the war. It lost most of its territory except for what is now modern Turkey, and much of that was occupied by the French, the Italians, by the Greeks. In 1919, Greek troops invaded the country. The Turks managed to defeat them. In 1923, on October 29th, the Turkish Republic was proclaimed after the victory.
The dominant political figure was Mustafa Kemal, better known as Atatürk. He wanted to establish a modern and secularized Turkish state. Reforms for women were issued. This all sounds very progressive. Let's dive right into our discussions. Corry, could you tell us, what did the establishment of the Turkish Republic mean for the Turkish Jews?
Yes, thank you for this question, but the situation of the Jews was quite ambivalent. At the beginning, many Jews had mostly positive expectations for the new republic. This has also different reasons. During the Ottoman Empire, Jews had experienced anti-Semitism, or maybe more correctly, religious anti-Judaism, mainly from the side of Christians, Greeks and Armenians, and were sometimes relying on the protection of the Turkish or Ottoman state forces, which established a kind of Turkish-Jewish alliance towards the end of the Ottoman Empire. Especially in light of the atrocities committed by the retreating Greek troops at the end of the Turkish or Greek-Turkish War, 1919 to 1922, many of the Jews in Anatolia had regarded the Turks as liberators. Also, many of the Jewish intellectuals who act as spokespeople for the Jewish community shared the Kemalists' enthusiasm for progress and secularization. Some of them had already supported the movement led by the Young Turks against the repressive and authoritarian regime of Abdülhamid at the beginning of the century. Prominent representatives of the Jewish community repeatedly voiced the hope that the Jews of Turkey would merge into Turkish society on the basis of equal rights and become Turks of Jewish faith. But they would soon realize that they too would become victims of the Turkification policy. Turkish Republic, as you mentioned, was founded on the ruins of the multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire. And like in other new-built nation-states, so this is nothing special to Turkey, especially in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, the process of nation-building brought a rigid nationalism. A policy of Turkification was designed to ensure Turkish Muslim predominance actually in all areas of the society, and the economy, society, population. Jews and members of other minorities, so other mainly Christian, but also the Kurds, were subjected to a whole range of restrictive laws regarding, for example, freedom of movement or freedom of settle to choose where you live, funding for community facilities, occupational restrictions, banning non-Turks from a large number of job opportunities, and the freedom to organize. While Turkish nationalist organizations spread like mushrooms, Jews or Greeks could not organize. Everybody was forced to use only Turkish language in public. This campaign, called Vatandaş Türkçe konuş, Citizens Speak Turkish, in many places was quite violent and intimidating or even threatening. For example, at a Jewish hospital, the nationalists came and crashed down the Hebrew inscription on the hospital. And mainly the job restrictions and also the intimidating climate led to a mass emigration of Jews. Almost 1/3 of the Jews left Turkey in the 20s and 30s.
10 years after the establishment of the Turkish Republic, in 1933, Hitler came to power in Germany. How did the rise of the Nazis in Germany affect the Jews in Turkey?
First of all, before I go to the Jews, there was almost no public response. The seizure of power by the National Socialists and the violent actions against Jews triggered protests and demonstrations all over the world. In Turkey, of course, all political activity outside the single party, the so-called GHP, was banned at the time, and also there was no freedom of press. Nevertheless, a small group of Ashkenazi Jews gathered at Taksim Square. Many of you will know Taksim Square from the uprising in 2013. It's the main square in the center of Istanbul, and they attempted to hold a public action in solidarity with the Jews of Germany. But this action was oppressed by the Turkish police after a short time, and several of the Jewish youth were arrested. However, this was a very, very marginal voice. In the political mainstream, Hitler's ascension to power and Nazi policy up to 1939 or to the beginning of the war did not cause significant concern. Several leading journalists and politicians repeatedly expressed their open admiration for Germany and for the new regime, as they had previously did for Mussolini. Mussolini was a model, and they took over some of his laws even. And these were not marginal voices. Recep Peker, for example, who was the general secretary of the single party until 1937, I guess, and then became interior minister or minister of the interior in 1942, expressed his enthusiasm for the Nazi regime and proposed adopting fascist organization model. Or for the press, Falih Rıfkı Atay was Atatürk's confidant and friend, and was the leading journalist in Turkey. His he gave the guideline for the press. And he described also his admiration in a series of articles from Germany. However, the persecution of the Jews, insofar as it was mentioned, was in some articles called ridiculous or childish. But others expressed their understanding because the Jews were threatening the German. And for the Jews, I think the most important was that anti-Semitism grew in Turkey.
As with other states that were established after the First World War, minority rights were guaranteed by international contracts. And in the case of Turkey, this was the Treaty of Lausanne. It guaranteed all non-Muslim minorities, so explicitly non-Muslims, the same political rights as Muslims. And the background, of course, is also the genocide of the Armenians. Together with the secular character of the new state of the Turkish Republic under Ataturk, this must have improved the situation of Turkish Jews.
Yes and no. Many Jews, as I just told you, many Jews had these positive expectations. But in reality, however, Jews and other non-Muslims first, they were excluded from their rights as equal citizens of Turkey. Although on the paper, they were citizens of Turkey. But according to the political self-image of the Turkish Republic, a true or a real Turk, in Turkish we would say Öztürk, had to be a Muslim and his mother tongue had to be Turkish. And this distinction, for example, became evident in the debates regarding the constitution passed in 1924. The majority of lawmakers opposed the proposal that all citizens of Turkey be declared Turks and mentioned them as Kanun Türk'ü, Turks by law. And as I just mentioned, they were excluded through numerous unofficial and semi-official regulations from equal rights. As for their minority rights granted by the Lausanne Treaty, these internationally granted rights intended to preserve cultural or community rights of the minorities. And this was completely opposed to the Kemalist interest in forced assimilation and the cultural Turkification of the population. As a treaty was to be implemented, or at least on paper, supervised by the League of Nations, that was a further reason for the Kemalists to regard these articles as an instrument that would enable the European powers to intervene in their affairs. And from the beginning, leading politicians of the Republic People's Party, the GHP or the Single Party, had made it clear that they aimed to eliminate this part, and consequently, they put enormous pressure on the minorities. For example, they blackmailed the Jews in spreading fake news that the Jews of Turkey had sent a letter of loyalty to the Spanish royal family. This was, of course, fake news, but the pressure was so great that the spokespersons of the Jewish community waived their rights of the Lausanne Treaty, or parts of them, and other rights were taken by other pressure. On the contrary, actually, one can say that the minority rights in the Treaty of Lausanne are still being used until today to accuse the non-Muslim minorities of disloyalty. They are always seen as the enemy, the fifth column, because the great powers had used during Ottoman time the minorities to intervene. The Lausanne Treaty is seen as a consequence of that. And with regard to the Jews in Turkey, Lausanne has yet another special negative effect. One of the central narratives of Islamist anti-Semitism in Turkey revolves around the participation of then Chief Rabbi Chaim Nahum as an advisor to the Turkish government or the Turkish delegation at the Lausanne Treaty. He allegedly persuaded İsmet İnönü, the prime minister, to abolish the caliphate in order to strengthen Zionism, which is completely bullshit. Chaim Nahum was opposed to Zionism. He was not a Zionist. And of course, in Lausanne, they did not discuss the abolition of the caliphate. But for rumors, it is not important to be true or not. Fake news have their own force. And this is one of the central narratives of Islamist anti-Semitism linked to Lausanne.
What you told us is that the social and economic situation of the Jews in Turkey decreased actually after the founding of the Turkish Republic. But when the Nazis came to power, there's a very remarkable episode because a large number of Jewish and non-Jewish academics who were forced to leave Germany actually found refuge in Turkey. I think it was about 82 professors who were given the opportunity to come to Turkish universities. So, for instance, the future mayor of Berlin, Ernst Reuter, was one of them. And also the German architect Bruno Taut, who I think designed the building of the University of Ankara, came to Turkey. And in the words of one researcher that you cite in your book, the University of Istanbul became by that the largest and best German university, which I found very remarkable. Can you tell us more about this remarkable group of German and for large parts also Jewish immigrants?
Yeah, indeed, this is a real important event or development or historical fact. But again, it has two sides. The dismissal of Jews and political opponents from universities and cultural institutions in Germany was one of the first measures by the Nazi regime already in the spring of 1933. And by coincidence, at the very same time, the Turkish government decided for the closing of the Darülfünun, the university in Istanbul that was founded in Ottoman times, since the Kemalists wanted to cut all continuity between the Ottoman past and the new established Kemalist republic. So they dismissed all the professors, among them some Turkish Jews, and now searched for new people. And also, this was just one reason. The other one, they had ambitious plans for modernizing the country and build up cultural institutions, etc. So the coincidence of this reform and the sudden expulsion of an entire academic elite from academic institutions in Germany facilitated the emigration of numerous academics to Turkey. And as you mentioned, and among them were numerous really internationally respected academics from a wide range of disciplines. So for the government in Turkey, this was a unique opportunity, or speaking for both sides, this was a win-win situation. About 130 scholars who were classified by the Nazis as Jewish found employment as professors, advisors to Turkish state agencies, building up the theater, the opera, and many buildings. Others followed as lecturers or assistants, and also a smaller number of non-Jewish but politically persecuted people like Ernst Reuter, who was not Jewish but a social democrat. But since there was only one big university with different faculties in Turkey, the one in Istanbul, and the second university in Ankara was just newly founded. So almost all of them were in Istanbul and stepped on one another's feet. And that made Istanbul to the most, as you quoted, the best German university, because all were in one university, or almost. There were some in Ankara. And the legacy of these professors left behind and their contribution to the establishment of the universities is hardly to overestimate. Some of the textbook, what they wrote, are still in use or had been in use when I made my research. I don't know. I think today they may be outdated. And the buildings still exist, and the opera still exists. And so, yeah, they have really an enormous legacy. And it was remarkable that even in the authoritarian regime of Kemal Atatürk, all of a sudden they could speak about freedom and philosophy and things that were normally not discussed in Turkey. But we have to be in mind, first of all, there were also pro-Nazi German academics in Turkey at the same time. So it was not only in exile. And secondly, there was no admission for ordinary Jewish refugees. So this famous exile and the numerous publications on this may give the impression that Turkey was an important country of exile, which that's not true. Mm-hmm. But this academic exile is really remarkable and wonderful.
Outstanding.
Yeah, outstanding, not wonderful.
No, wonderful one.
Okay.
You just talked about the Islamic anti-Semitism. In your book, you also write about imported anti-Semitism from Germany. What do you mean by that? And what's the difference between the two?
Okay, anti-Semitism already existed in Turkey. This is important to stress. First of all, almost half of the population of the Ottoman Empire was Christian until the mid of the 19th century. And of course, there was Christian anti-Judaism, and this infected also the Muslim population. There's few research on that, but it existed. And for example, at the end of the 19th century, to give one example, one of the most important Ottoman intellectuals, Ebu Ziya Tevfik, who worked at the Constitution and who was one of the leading journalists, published a book that was pure anti-Semitic and collected the modern anti-Semitic tropes that were at the time in Europe discussed. Also, in the period between the end of the First World War and the establishing of the Republic, parts of the press launched an anti-Jewish campaign. Jews were accused of double-dealing and disloyalty and were portrayed as exploiters and war profiteers. One of the reasons for this was that Jews had become more visible as a minority after the murder and expulsion of Armenian and Greeks. Because prior to that, the Jews were in numbers, but also in economic force, the smallest minority. Armenians and Greek occupied much more positions. And now the Jews sometimes could fill
the gap
that Armenians or Greeks had left. And the chauvinist and xenophobic sentiments that during the war directed primarily against Christian groups now turned against Jews. So there was an existing anti-Semitism in Turkey. But, and the second word on the historical background is in the 30s, the Turkish nationalism really took on racist traits. There was a Turkish history thesis declaring the Turks to the oldest civilization almost on Earth, or in the whole region, composing the Middle East and Eastern Europe, or the Turkish language to be the mother of all languages on the world. So it really took on completely racist traces. But what now came on top, during the 30s, classics of anti-Semitic literature, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, writings by Adolf Hitler, Theodor Fritsch, or Henry Ford, were translated into Turkish. And some of these translations were bankrolled by Germany. And although Turkish authorities sometimes banned anti-Semitic publications, they have been reprinted in countless editions to this day. So that was, so to say, the beginning of this really aggressive and predominant anti-Semitic literature. And for example, the most important among them, whose 30 or even more anti-Semitic books are still hugely influential today, was Cevat Rifat Attilhan, a former military, and in 1933 and 4 published a magazine called Milli Inkilab, National Revolution. And in the 1930s, he used cartoons from Julius Streicher's Stürmer. He went to Nuremberg and met with Streicher. We have to say in his memories, he exaggerated his connections to high-ranking German Nazi leaders. He said he met Hitler and Goering and Goebbels and all of them. That's bullshit. But in any case, he was in contact with Streicher, and one of his books also was translated into German. He was criticized by most of Turkish intellectuals of the time as lunatic and as an extremist. And sometimes his magazine got forbidden. But with in this time, anti-Semitic stereotypes began to find their way into mainstream publications, and even critical cartoons repeated anti-Semitic stereotypes.
So, Corry, let's go back to the beginning of the 1930s. You told us that after the founding of the Republic, the economic and social situation of the Jews in Turkey deteriorated. But at the same time, I read in your book that there was nearly no violence against Jews, with one notable exception. This was in 1934, so in the time when German Jewish refugees flocked to the Turkish universities, there happened pogroms mainly in Thrace. So this is the part west of Istanbul, the European part of Turkey. How did that affect the overall situation of the Jews in Turkey? Because they must have remembered the genocide of the Armenians, the mass flight of Greeks during the War of Independence, and so on. So I would imagine that they were in panic when these acts of violence happened.
Yes, like always, it's more complicated. Indeed, there was an anti-Jewish pogrom in 1934, not only in Thrace, which is, if you say west of Istanbul, I think that's a little bit belittling. The whole European part of Turkey with frontier to Greece and Bulgaria. First of all, this used to be a very important part of the Ottoman Empire for Jews. So, for example, the town of Edirne was one of the first, or for 150 years, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, and an important place where Jews flocked. So we have had, I think, 13 or 14 synagogues only in the town of Edirne. And the whole region was important for Jews. And Edirne, for example, was historically also a town where Jewish knowledge, culturally and religious scripts were produced. So, and with the Jewish history since ages, even prior, or not even, prior to the arrival of the Turks. And as you said, it's right. You can't, I spoke about the repression against Jews and the nationalist policy. This is at no stage comparable to anything that happened in Germany or even other anti-Semitic states. And the background of this pogrom in Thrace also was not only or predominantly directed against Jews. The background was a new law in 1934, the so-called settlement law, or Iskan Kanunu, which was it's aimed at the Turkification of the population. The whole territory of Turkey was categorized in 4 categories regarding at which degree the population was Turkish or Turkified. And those who were not Turkified should be forcibly resettled to other places. Even families were divided. It aimed mainly against Kurds. So, you know maybe about the genocidal campaign against the region of Dersim, where Alevi Kurds lived in 37 and 38. Some 30,000 people were either killed or forcibly relocated. So this is the background, and the most level of violence was not against the Jews, but against, for example, the Kurdish Alevis. This we have to keep in mind, not to get a false impression that Jews were the main target. But when Mussolini declared the Mediterranean Sea as Mare Nostrum, the fear of Italian imperialism and also a fear of Bulgaria was predominant. And so Turkey tried to force minorities from the region in the Straits, around the Straits. So it was not only Thrace, it was also the Anatolian part of the Straits. And the newly announced governor for the whole region under exceptional law, Ibrahim Tali Öngören, was an ardent anti-Semite. So in June of 1934, Jews were forced to leave, either by attacks, by boycotts, in some places by pogroms, and very often also with order from the state forces, either from the JHP, the state party, or even police forces. For example, in Edirne or Uzunköprü, the calls to leave the cities were made by the security forces. And in Kırklareli, where was a real pogrom, the security forces watched the going on and enriched themselves. They stole the belongings of the Jews. Several thousand Jews fled to Istanbul or left the country for Palestine or for Greece. And which is important, the Jewish existence in this important area was gone forever. Very few Jews returned. And regarding your question, first of all, it was the threat against Jews was at the same time when, for example, the campaign Vatandaş Türkçe konuş, Citizen Speak Turkish, had such a level in Izmir that Jews were afraid to leave their houses. This is what foreign diplomats wrote in their reports. And the immigration was forever. And of course, it recalled, as you said, in some reports of people who have lived this, it recalled the memory of the Armenian genocide. So the fear was really very important or very feelable in some of the reports, or some of the memories, sorry, not reports.
In 1938, with the annexation of Austria and the November pogrom, the situation of Germany's Jews became desperate. Those who could left the country. How did the Turkish government react to this high number of refugees?
As mentioned earlier, the decisive guiding principle of Turkish policy was the Turkification of the country and its population. And a central aim was to increase the numerical predominance of Muslim Turkish population. So 1.5 million Muslims or Turks from Balkan countries were invited. But with the İskan Kanunu that I just mentioned regarding Thrace, Jews were declared as unwanted element. Roma people also were declared as unwanted element. And already in May 1937, the Turkish Foreign Office issued a secret brief aimed at preventing the immigration of Jews. So it didn't start in 1938, but the Turkish policy was already aimed to prevent Jewish immigration into the country. And for example, prior we talked about the emigres, the academics. The contracts were for 5 years, and some of them in 1938 were not prolonged. And in June of 1938, Turkey passed 2 laws that prohibited the entry or stay of any person without a valid passport or ID card. And although the wording of this law doesn't mention Jews, it was clear from the context that it was meant or directed at Jews. This becomes also apparent from a Turkish inquiry to the German Consulate General in Istanbul. A few days after the passage of this law, Turkish police suggested to the Germans to mark the passports of German Jews. This is the same thing that Swiss asked, and we know about the J stamp. So the Turks were not alone, and I think the Swiss inquiry was decisive, but the Turks asked the same question, and it was openly against Jews. Turkey did not participate in the conference of Evian, but in the main press they wrote, "Oh, we wish them full success, the Jews won't come," or something like that. And it was exactly at this time that the Turkish government issued a secret decree which barred, quote, "foreign Jews who are subject to restrictions in their home countries," end of quote, "from entry into Turkey, regardless of their present religious affiliation." The decree was explicitly aimed at people who had been classified by the German or other anti-Semitic regimes as Jews and not against religious Jews. And as a consequence, Turkish consulates now demanded proof of Aryan descent before granting entry visas to Turkey.
Okay.
Yeah, to give some figures, I think it's important because there's really a wrong or misunderstanding. Approximately 600 Jewish emigres who were legally admitted to Turkey, with some family members made up to 1,000 Jews who were legally allowed to live in Turkey. This is just over 1/10 of, or 1.5 of 1% of the approximately 400,000 Jews who left Germany and Austria. So Turkey is not mentioned in any statistic on refuge countries.
I think it's very important to mention, though, that this was not a Turkish specialty. You said it yourself that Swiss tried to restrict Jewish immigration by asking the German authorities to have a J stamp in the passports and so. But okay, let's talk about Turkey during the Holocaust. The war began in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland, but only in 1941 Germany invaded and occupied Yugoslavia and Greece, 2 neighbors of Turkey, and 2 other neighbors of Turkey, Bulgaria and Romania, were allies of the Germans. So in 1941, the war was very, very close at the Turkish borders and the danger was imminent.
And with the invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22nd in 1941, German troops killed hundreds of thousands of Jews. The Black Sea actually became a war zone. So Turkey remained the only neutral country in the whole region.
And this was very important because the most important destination for Jewish refugees in Eastern and Southeastern Europe was Palestine. That was the only place to go. And the only way to reach it was by sea, which was very, very dangerous because the Mediterranean was a war zone, or by land via Turkey.
And that means Turkey was an important transit country on the way to Palestine. But the Turkish government was very reluctant to grant transit visas. What was the reason for this reluctance?
Actually, I would say Turkey could have been an important transit country. Unfortunately, it was not. But already since 1939, when the Mediterranean, including the Aegean Sea, had become a theater of war. Until then, the flight route went often from Italy or France, and Turkey was not so important. But as you said, it became more and more important, and after 1941, it was the only road. But in August of 1940, Chaim Barlas was accredited as the official representative of the Jewish Agency in Turkey. And already at that time, in 1940, prior to the war against the Soviet Union, he described the situation after his arrival in Turkey as follows. Quote, thousands of Jewish refugees were trapped in Kovno, Bucharest, or other European cities. They held passports and immigration visas to Palestine and had been promised Syrian visas. The only obstacle remaining was the prohibition against their passage through Turkey. End of quote. And of course, during the following years, Turkey's restrictions were just one factor in this. Others were, of course, the policies by Great Britain restricting the immigration to Palestine, and of course the Germans' massive efforts to close off Jewish escape routes. I think always by describing the shortcoming of Turkish policy, we always have to keep in mind that Turkey was just one part in a huge picture. But coming back to Barlas, for 4 months he was negotiating with Turkish authorities, and eventually in beginning of 1941, the secret decree that I had mentioned a little bit before was somewhat relaxed, and Turkey permitted Jews who had received Palestine certificates prior to the war got permission to pass Turkey. So during the 1 year of 1941, more than 4,800 Jews could reach Palestine via Turkey. Because they had Palestine certificate, this is important. It was Great Britain that had closed the border to Palestine. Actually, after these people had transited Turkey, Ankara only allowed a very small number of Jews per month. And Barlas and the Jewish Agency and other Jewish aid committees and organizations made plans over plans over plans. There are huge books on this. I won't name all the plans because most of them failed. A multitude of bureaucratic obstacles made Turkey a needle's eye with regard to rescue activities. And the most well-known consequence of this restriction is the tragic history of the Struma, a vessel carrying 765 Jewish refugees, most of whom had fled the mass slaughter in Romania. The ship reached Istanbul in December of 1941, and the engine was broken. It was almost had no working engine, and Turkey's authorities refused the passengers to disembark, although Jewish relief organizations had offered to assume all costs of housing and feeding until these people would get permission to continue to Palestine. And on February 24 in 1942, so after a little bit more than 2 months, massive Turkish police forces entered the ship in order to prevent any resistance of the passengers and towed the helpless vessel without an engine into the open sea where it was hit by a Soviet missile or torpedo who thought it was a German or Romanian ship. And just one Jew, one of the passengers, David Stollier, who managed to save himself by swimming 24 hours, all refugees died off the coast of Istanbul. And it's also interesting that Stollier was arrested by the Turkish police forces and put into jail and interviewed and interrogated for 3 months or some weeks. And after that, he could continue to Palestine. And this ship, Struma, has become something like a symbol of the Turkish negative policy, but there were many more ships. I read many memories of Jewish refugees on other ships. They say the same thing on Turkish policy. Turkey only really changed its stance in the summer of 1944, when Germany was already almost defeated, and all the neighboring countries like Bulgaria and Romania had changed sides. So this was, and Turkey also Turkey was allied with Germany in a way, and now wanted to ally with the Western allies. And only in this year, 1944, 6,800 Jews could pass Turkey. But in the crucial years of 42 and 43, a total of fewer than 2,000 Jewish refugees were able to cross Turkey legally. And I have these figures because the Jewish Agency really kept notes on every single person. And which is interesting, of these 2,000 people or 2,000 Jews in the years 42 and 43, about 25% or a quarter of them were Jews who left Turkey because of the repression against Jews in Turkey.
Yeah, maybe you can tell us something about that, because in May 1941, so this is before the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Germans, in May 1941, the Turkish government introduced forced labor for non-Muslims. And this was a measure that mainly affected Jews, as there were nearly no other non-Muslims left in Turkey.
No.
No?
Jews were still the smallest minority.
Still the smallest minority. Okay.
Yeah.
So, but in November 1942, there was also a wealth tax that was introduced, and again, mainly directed against non-Muslims. Was there a reason that these measures were issued exactly at this specific time? Because November 1942, this is really at the height of the Holocaust, when the deportations from Western Europe started, and there were already extermination camps. Is there any connection between these two things in history, or don't you think that there was, because it's remarkable from time?
Yes, but I think it's not directly connected. I think it's a trap for historians always to conclude if there's a coincidence, to link them directly. I think the background is first the nationalist policy that I mentioned, that was not directed only against Jews, but also against Armenians and Greeks, and on another level also against Kurds. And the second reason is that Turkey, although it didn't participate in the war, had a war economy and shortages on every level. So you only could get food by food stamps. And Turkey enforced its military, and there was a shortcoming all over the country. And also, as I mentioned before, with the influence not only of Nazi Germany, but all surrounding countries were more or less anti-Semitic. This was the main current at the time. So this gave Turkey the opportunity to Turkify the economy. The wealth tax was introduced in November of 42 and was accompanied by an anti-Semitic campaign in the press. Jews were portrayed as gaining from this war economy. And it's crazy because the wealth tax was officially levied on every person or every businessman. But the tax was classified in different groups, and Jews and other non-Muslims had to pay 100 times the same amount that other normal people had to pay. And many of them, for example, the business was worth £50,000 and they had to pay £50,000 tax. So some people I interviewed and also people writing their memories described that everything was confiscated, unto the bulbs in the lamps. They had nothing left. They were sitting with candles in their former houses, and those unable to pay were deported to labor camps. Labor camps close to the Soviet border in a very harsh region with snow, and they had to do labor work in street construction. And there it's true that although the Jews were the smallest minority of the three, most of those deported were Jews. And also the press campaign against Jews, or mainly targeted Jews in a very anti-Semitic way, also portrayed Armenians like Jews. This is interesting. This is another topic. But I think the background, again, is it was an opportunity because wealth was never given back, although this special tax was abolished later in beginning of 1944 when Turkey wanted to change sides. But until today, there is no excuse, and the wealth has never given back. So many people were really impoverished until to be naked. Their carpets and their furniture was auctioned on the streets, and it was a horror for most of them. So they were so intimidated that many of them left Turkey after the war.
In your research, you speak of 2,200 up to 2,500 Jews of Turkish origin who were deported to extermination camps. What was the knowledge about the Holocaust in Turkey?
Just one word, how Turkish Jews became, or Jews from Turkish origin became victims of the Holocaust. As a result of all this nationalist policy, about a third of the Jewish population had left Turkey and emigrated either to both of the Americas or to European countries. About 25 to 30,000 Jews were living in Europe at the time from Turkish origin. Of course, compared with Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, these Turkish or former Ottoman Jews were a clear minority. But if you consider that by 1935, there were not even 80,000 Jews left in the Turkish Republic, these Turkish exiles communities become much more significant. And for example, they constituted a larger group or a group double as much as the entire Jewish population of Turkey today. And the bulk of Turkish Jewish immigrants lived in Paris, where they founded no fewer than 4 Turkish Sephardic synagogues. So this was a whole universe with their own papers, with their own music groups, with their own associations, and so on. And in almost all European countries, you had Turkish Sephardic synagogues and communities. And after the subsequent occupation of European countries by Nazi Germany, these Turkish Jews also were subjected to the Nazi Germany's persecution of the Jews. Protests by various foreign diplomats, among them Turkish diplomats, forced the Nazis to take foreign policy considerations into account. And this led to the defining of hierarchies of persecution for Jews of various groups and nationalities. I think this is also a specialty of the German genocide on the Jews, this bureaucratic.
Sure.
It's so unbelievable. They wrote files on letters of one single Turkish Jews. In the same time, they murdered tens of thousands of Jews. But it gave the impression of a legal system. This is, for me, one of the most disturbing experiences in my research, to see with which kind of acriby, how they proceeded to persecute and file every single foreign Jew. But on the other hand, as a neutral country that played a significant role in the German war effort, with Chrome and also because of its geographic position, Turkey had enormous means to protect its Jewish citizens if it had wished to. Some Turkish diplomats repeatedly and successfully intervened on behalf of Turkish Jews, but this was the minority. In contrast to the efforts of individual diplomats, the main rationale behind Ankara's policy towards Turkish Jews under Nazi rule was to prevent their re-immigration to Turkey. Just as they didn't want Jews in general to come to Turkey, they also tried to prevent the return of their own citizens.
So what can we say that Turkey know about the Holocaust?
Yeah, again, I think it's important to be aware that it might be misleading to look at this question from what we know today, when the subject of the Holocaust is so predominant in Western historiography, almost in Western Europe, in the United States, and in Israel. So at that time, Turkey was no exception. The Holocaust didn't play any role. Although Jewish organizations, especially in or from Poland, and also the Polish government in exile, reported quite early on the systematic mass murder of Jews, it took several years before the international public, press, and also politicians reported on this, and also before politicians were able to understand the dimension of the German genocide. The fact that the Germans had built factories to murder the Jews was just beyond anything they could imagine. So although we have the reports and letters and telegraphs, almost nobody wanted to believe or to understand. Turkey's consular representations in the German Reich and the occupied territories had been witness to the persecution of the Jews here from the outset. For example, the Turkish honorary consul in Hamburg, it's my hometown, he was Jewish and he committed suicide in 1938. Or we have so many other examples. And also, since Turkey hosted both Jewish aid organizations and Polish politicians in exile, and also some Jews who were able to escape the mass murder, they arrived in Turkey and gave accounts. But still, it didn't play any role in the Turkish press. But the Turkish press, due to the alliance with Germany, was under enormous pressure and under a German censorship. So we know little about discussions in the inner circle of politics, but as far as I found out, it was not a topic. And in the publicity or in the public, it didn't play a role. In March 1943, the government gazette Ayin Tarihi, this is a foreign policy monthly, they reported on a speech by British Foreign Secretary Eden about the destruction of the Jews in Poland. So it can be assumed that by March 1943, the Turkish government knew about the systematic murder of the Jews. But even Ahmet Emin Yalman, he's a very well-known liberal democratic journalist, one of the main figures at the time, who was from time to time persecuted because he was quite distant to the government. And he was also attacked by various people because he was a Dunme, or he was from Dunme descent. But he wrote a book in 1945, just to the end of the war, Nazilin iç yüzü, so the inner face of Nazi rule. And he doesn't mention the persecution of the Jews. So I think it was not a topic. Pardon, there were, of course, Jewish newspapers, they mentioned it.
And how did Turkey deal with the Holocaust after the war? Was this, after 1945, a topic at all?
Holocaust and Holocaust memory is not an important topic in Turkey, no. Even at the end of the war, when Turkish Jews who were liberated from concentration camps in Bergen-Belsen and Ravensbrück reached Istanbul in April of 1945, only 2 Jewish papers interviewed these survivors, while the non-Jewish Turkish press did not even mention them. And interesting enough, the Turkish authorities at first denied entrance to Turkey to these people and then interned them. This low interest in the Holocaust is true for many countries that were not affected by Germany's occupation or neutral during World War II. But I think in case of Turkey, this is striking, since during the time of the Holocaust, a huge figure of Turkish Jews were living in Nazi-occupied European countries and became victims to Germany's persecution of the Jews. Almost every Jewish family in Turkey has relatives who became victims of the Holocaust. The indifference of Turkish government since 1945 to the fate of the Turkish Jewish victims of the Shoah is illustrated by the fact that from 1945 to this day, Turkish government agencies have not compiled the names of the victims to ascertain their fates. It took more than 40 years for the Turkish political class to discover the Jews as a useful topic. During the second half of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, the systematic violations of human rights in Turkey and the repression against the Kurdish population became an almost permanent topic in international political boards. Also, almost during the same time, the genocide on the Armenians started to become a topic in several countries, whereupon Turkey started or heavily enforced its campaign and interventions for denial. It was in this context that Turkey discovered the Jews and invented a rescue myth, according to which Turkish diplomats had saved Jews even at the risk of their own lives. These stories are spread in several books, in novels, but also in so-called scientific works or in films sponsored and presented by Turkish agencies all over the world. And this myth is now, we can say, the official version of history in Turkey regarding Turkey and the Holocaust. But these representations and these stories are not only fake and free invention, but also an insult and disrespectful to the Turkish Jewish victims, for whose fate this version of history is not at all interested. Turkish Jews only appear as extras in the supposedly heroic deeds of Turkish diplomats. And as mentioned before, the most important motive for the creation and spread of this myth is the denial of the Armenian genocide. These stories should help to win over international organizations, including Jewish organizations and the State of Israel, as supporters for the denial of the Armenian genocide by Turkey. To date, around 25 or 30 Jews of Turkish origin who lived in Europe at the time and experienced the Holocaust, and many of whom lost their families, have written down and published their memories. But none of these books, most of which were written in French, have been translated into Turkish. This also underlines the Turkish disinterest.
Okay, thank you very much, Corry, for being here. This was really a fascinating talk about Turkey and the Holocaust.
Yeah, thank you for hosting me and listening to me.
Thank you for listening to this episode on Turkey and the Holocaust. In our next episode, we'll stay in the region and speak about Greece and especially about the city of Salonika and its ancient old Jewish community.